Mongol minister, right near the very collapse of the empire, with one Mongol minister proposing at one point that all individuals surnamed Chang, Wang, Liu, Li, and Chao be executed. Dominance was, amazingly, the tiny Dutch Republic of the 17th century was, once again, tolerance. But now, tolerance of a radically new kind. After the fall of Rome in 476 came the rise of the great religious empires, those of Christianity and Islam. Now, unlike the ancient polytheistic religions, which really assumed that different peoples would worship different gods, I mean, every city had its own god, both Christianity and Islam insisted that there was one and only one true faith. In this sense, Christianity and Islam were inherently intolerant in a way that the ancient religions were not. Whether or not sanctioned by scripture, the result was a millennium of religious strife and bloodshed. In the West, the era of religious wars slowly gave way to the Enlightenment. Now, for the Enlightenment thinkers, tolerance was not merely instrumental. It was a human right. And thus was born the modern ideal of tolerance that we teach here at the law school. Persecution was not only bad strategy, it violated the rights of man. The Dutch Republic was the first European state to embrace the new tolerance. In 1579, the United Provinces of the Netherlands declared in its founding charter that each person shall remain free in his religion, and no one shall be investigated or persecuted because of his religion. Almost overnight, the Dutch Republic became a magnet for religious refugees from all over Europe: French Huguenots, German Lutherans, Mennonites, Quakers, and Pilgrims. Of the tens of thousands of immigrants that poured in, two groups in particular were pivotal in Holland's rise. First were the Jewish bankers, merchants, and diamond traders fleeing Spanish and Portuguese inquisitions. These men, among the richest in the world, financiers to Europe's royalty, bankrollers of armies, turned Amsterdam into the world's commercial and financial center. Second, and even more important, were the Protestant industrialists and artisans from Antwerp, Ghent, and Bruges, who brought with them not only wealth, but critical in style technology, and, as Max Weber would later put it, the spirit of capitalism itself. With the decisive contributions of these two groups, the Dutch soon became the financial, technological, and commercial leaders of Europe, and indeed the world. But even so, I feel the question in the audience, can it really be said that the Dutch Republic was a hyperpower? After all, its army was not the largest in Europe. It was the second largest, although it was probably the most efficient and well-equipped. Well, I think so, and that's because I think to focus on the size of its standing army is really to misunderstand how the Dutch Republic triumphed over its rivals. The Dutch never sought to conquer the European continent. Its empire, of course, was a maritime empire, devoted far more to commercial expansion than territorial expansion. By the 17th century, naval might had become the royal road to world dominance, and the Dutch took control of the seas. The extent of Dutch maritime dominance is astonishing. Of the 20,000 ships involved in the world's carrying trade in the 17th century, approximately 16,000 of those were Dutch. In 1639, Dutch warships humiliated the once indomitable Spanish Navy, destroying 60 of Spain's 77 warships at a cost of just one Dutch ship. At its peak, the Dutch Navy was roughly equal to the English and French naval forces combined, which is really a staggering fact if you remember that France's population was 10 to 20 times larger than the Dutch Republic. Controlling the oceans, the Dutch completely cornered Europe's rich trades. That is the immensely lucrative global traffic in luxury commodities. Dutch ships traveled to distant corners of the world, carrying back East Indian pepper and spices, sugar from Brazil and Sao Tome, Turkish mohair, Castilian wool, Indian cotton, and raw diamonds. The Dutch either traded these riches throughout Europe or brought them back to Holland, where the raw materials were processed and then re-exported at enormous profit in the form of luxury tapestries, patterned silks, fine linens, and exquisitely cut gemstones. Between 1621 and 1675, the Dutch Republic was far and away the richest nation on earth, with by far the most upward mobility. Sons of cheesemakers lived in palaces with marble and alabaster columns, as one indignant European critic sputtered at the time. Mr. Everyman thinks he's entitled to wear what he likes so long as he can pay for it. Can you bear it when you see that a tailor has a parlor hung with gold tapestry? How did the Dutch achieve all this? Largely through immigrant investment, immigrant innovations in raising capital, immigrant manufacturing skills, technology, and trading networks. Note then that the rise of the Dutch Republic marked a dramatic transformation in the nature of both world power and tolerance. With the Dutch, commerce replaced conquest as the driving engine of wealth creation, and immigration replaced invasion and annexation as the best way to incorporate the world's best and brightest. Tolerance was equally essential to Great Britain, the successors to the Dutch on the world stage. For most of the 16th and 17th centuries, what is now Great Britain was a pit of vicious religious and ethnic warfare. Protestants massacred Catholics, Catholics beheaded Protestants, and Englishmen slaughtered Irish, Scots, and Welsh, all of whom retaliated in kind. There was, however, no persecution of Jews because there were no Jews. They'd all been expelled in 1290. All this was to change after 1689. In that year, Parliament passed the Bill of Rights and the Act of Toleration. 20 years later, England united with Scotland and Wales, and despite continuing anti-Catholic bigotry and brutality, by the early 18th century, Great Britain had replaced the Dutch Republic in reputation as the most tolerant nation in Europe. Because of England's dramatic turn to tolerance after 1689, three groups in particular, Jews, Huguenots, and most importantly, the Scots, were able to enter into British society with unprecedented freedom. The benefits to Great Britain were immediate. England became the new haven for Europe's Jews, who, with astonishing rapidity, founded the London Stock Exchange, brought diamond and bullion trading to Britain, and almost single-handedly made London the world's new financial center. Meanwhile, instead of wasting resources fighting the Scots, now the Scots became Great Britain's chief empire builders, and at the same time, the driving force in Britain's Industrial Revolution. The most critical inventions of the era, the Watt steam engine, the hot blast furnace, the integrated cotton mill, were created by Scots, who, incidentally, were also Britain's leading thinkers and writers. David Hume and Adam Smith were both Scots. There's a reason no one ever talks about the English Enlightenment, but they do, of course, talk about the Scottish Enlightenment. The contributions of these previously excluded groups were absolutely pivotal to Britain's rise to world dominance. Take, for example, the Bank of England, the country's most powerful financial institution, and a chief reason that Britain was able to triumph over France. A Scot conceived the idea for the bank, Huguenots funded it, and Jews brokered its biggest loans. But if Great Britain followed the Dutch formula of tolerance at home and is turning itself into a magnet for enterprising immigrants, it pursued basically a Roman strategy abroad. Like the Romans, the British conquered, annexed, and colonized, with India as the jewel of the empire. Also like the Romans, the British were masters of strategic tolerance. They enlisted, educated, and trained a large cadre of native bureaucrats and elites. They filled the ranks of the imperial army with hundreds of thousands of native soldiers. In the First World War, more than 1 million Indians served the empire abroad. But, also like the Romans, British tolerance too had limits it could not cross. At home, the problem was Catholic Ireland. Abroad, the problem was racism. The British could never quite treat their non-white colonies the same way they treated their white colonies. And these limits on British tolerance, these failures to live up to its own Enlightenment ideals, would come back to haunt the empire, helping to tear it apart in the 20th century. Meanwhile, another power, itself a former British colony, was rising. This brings me at last to the United States. Now, of America's ascent to hyperpower status, I'm going to say almost nothing here. If my thesis is correct, that the secret to world dominance lies in relative tolerance, that is the ability to attract the world's best and brightest talent, then the United States, as a nation of immigrants, founded on the principle of religious tolerance, has always had a leg up. To be sure, while the United States has always been relatively religiously tolerant, really from the very beginning, unfortunately, it demonstrated extreme racial and ethnic intolerance for much of its history, most notably towards Native Americans, African Americans, and other non-whites. It was only after the Second World War, with Brown versus Board of Education and the Civil Rights Revolution, that the United States began developing, however fitfully and imperfectly, into one of the most ethnically and racially open societies in world history. Not coincidentally, this was also the period in which the United States achieved world dominance. Now, in my book, I do try to carefully make the case that America's growth and success, always from the beginning, from its westward expansion to its industrial explosion, to its winning the race for the atomic bomb, to Silicon Valley and its domination of the computer age. I try to argue, make the case that these were all direct products of immigrant contributions. But I won't try to make that case. I think is to return to the 21st century and address some of the major challenges I see facing the United States today. And I'm going to focus principally on the international dimension. For all the dramatic transformations of the last 2,000 years, the United States today, amazingly, faces the same fundamental problem confronted by every hyperpower in history. But because it is a modern democratic hyperpower, the United States is especially ill-equipped to deal with this problem. Let me explain. Every hyperpower in history has faced a difficulty that, for lack of a better term, I will call the problem of glue. And by this term, I mean the problem of finding ways to generate goodwill, cooperation, and ideally loyalty among the foreign populations that are conquered and dominated. History's first hyperpower never solved this problem. As the Achaemenid Persian Empire expanded, it came to include, of course, increasingly diverse peoples. The problem was the empire had no overarching political identity or glue to unite it. Only sheer military might held it together. So, under Persian rule, Greeks and Egyptians certainly didn't think of themselves as Persians. They hated the Persians. Obviously, they didn't feel any loyalty to the empire. As a result, when a stronger, more charismatic military leader, Alexander of Macedon, swept through the region, elites throughout the empire simply switched their allegiances. They were not traitors because they had never been patriots. A similar fate befell the Mongols. With no common identity to bind together its massive European, Middle Eastern, and Asian conquered peoples, who frankly were disgusted by their barbarian overlords, the Mongol world empire quickly splintered into 4 large kingdoms before breaking up altogether. Of all of history's hyperpowers, only Rome really solved this problem of glue. Great Britain actually came pretty close, but only Rome really masterfully solved it, which I think goes a long way toward explaining its spectacular longevity. Now, it's very popular these days to compare the United States to Rome. I do it myself, I've been on many panels, and it's a great comparison in many ways. But ancient Rome had one huge advantage over the United States, and that is that Rome could make the people it conquered and dominated part of the Roman Empire. Defeated peoples from Scotland to Spain to West Africa all became subjects of the greatest power on earth. Even more significantly, Rome turned large numbers of conquered men, both elites and common soldiers, into Roman citizens, clothed with the high status and privilege that such citizenship entailed. By extending citizenship to Britons, Gauls, and Africans alike, Rome managed to Romanize vastly disparate people living continents apart, creating a common political identity, generating loyalty among its far-flung subjects. The United States today can do no such thing. Because it's a democracy, the United States does not try or want to make foreign populations its subjects, and certainly not its citizens. When the US government speaks of bringing democracy to the Middle East, it is not contemplating the people of Baghdad and Fallujah voting in the next US presidential elections. This, then, is America's dilemma. As a hyperpower, America does not only dominate Americans. Through its enormous economic leverage and military bases in 60-plus countries, the United States projects its power into every corner of the world, from Bolivia to Indonesia to Kuwait. But outside its borders, there is no political glue binding the United States to the billions of people who live under its shadow. Now, after September 11, as you all know, many influential voices, both conservative and liberal, began calling for an American empire, also sometimes called nation building, in either case referring to the same thing, and that is to the aggressive interventionist use of American military force, with or without international approval, to effect regime change. That is, to replace dictatorships, rogue states, and other threatening regimes with pro-market, pro-democracy, pro-American governments. This position, which again, even liberals like Thomas Friedman and Michael Ignatieff embraced, this position was in many ways completely understandable, given the threats of terrorism and the seeming invincibility of the American military. But the great mistake made by these champions of American militarism lies in assuming that the spread of markets, democracy, and American brands and consumer culture would be enough to Americanize the nations of the world, creating common values and even a desire for American leadership. This assumption was as naive as the belief that liberated Iraqis were going to greet American troops with sweets and flowers. Wearing a Yankees baseball cap and drinking Coca-Cola does not turn a Palestinian into an American. Today, the United States faces billions of people around the world, most of them poor, who want to be like Americans, but don't want to be under America's thumb, who want to dress and live like Americans, but who are denied visas by the American embassy, who are told over and over that America stands for freedom, but see only the American pursuit of self-interest. So in my opinion, on the international front, and what a lot of my students are working on with me, I think that on the international front, the crucial challenge for the years and decades to come will be whether America can address this problem of glue. Are there creative mechanisms, whether institutional or commercial, or through some marriage of constitutional and international law, through which the United States can, without losing its sovereignty, create a kind of common identity with the billions of people around the world it dominates, giving others more of a stake in America's success and leadership. Ironically, it may be that the only way that the United States can remain a hyperpower is if it stops trying so hard to be one. I think that the biggest challenge internally, domestically, has to do with, of course, the very hot immigration debate and our own tolerance and glue within the United States. Can we remain a tolerant, open nation in the face of pervasive insecurity, the threats of terrorism, and a possible economic downturn? Now, one of the main arguments in my book, as you can see, is that while the United States has certainly had its imperialist moments, basically America rose to world dominance on the Dutch model, not through conquest, but through its ability to attract and reward enterprising individuals of all backgrounds. In the Second World War, it was European immigrants who led the United States to winning the race for the atomic bomb, allowing the triumph of the Nazis. Silicon Valley and venture capital are to a very large extent immigrant creations. Between 1995 and 2005, a striking 52.4% of all Silicon Valley startups had at least one immigrant founder. So I think if America wants to maintain its global preeminence, particularly in this age of intense global economic competition, we really cannot turn our back on the formula that has served us so well over really since our founding. On the other hand, Another lesson that we get from looking at the history of all these hyperpowers over 2,000 years is that there is such a thing as too much diversity.